You don't belong in this living room anymore." My son-in-law said it so casually that for a moment I wondered if I had heard him wrong. The conversation around the dinner table stopped. The sound of silverware against china disappeared. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed louder than usual. I looked up slowly from my cup of coffee and saw Brian standing near the fireplace with his arms folded across his chest. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't angry either. Somehow that made it worse. My daughter Rebecca sat beside him, staring down at her plate as if the pattern on the porcelain had suddenly become fascinating. Neither of my grandchildren said a word. "I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and let me know where you're watching from, because sometimes the people who try to remove you from your own life forget who helped build theirs in the first place." The California sun was still shining through the large windows of the house my late husband and I had purchased 36 years earlier. Back then, the neighborhood had been little more than rolling hills and empty lots. We planted every rose bush in the front yard ourselves. We painted every room. We celebrated birthdays, graduations, anniversaries, and holidays beneath that roof. Every corner of that home held a memory. Yet there I sat, 71 years old, being told I no longer belonged in my own living room. "Brian," I said quietly, "what exactly do you mean by that?" He exchanged a quick glance with Rebecca before shrugging. "I mean, it's time for changes, Margaret. You've had your turn. This house needs to move forward." Move forward. Strange words for a man who had only been part of the family for 12 years. I waited for my daughter to object. I waited for her to remind him whose name had paid the mortgage after my husband passed away. I waited for her to say anything at all. Instead, she picked up her water glass and avoided my eyes. That silence hurt more than Brian's words. The room suddenly felt smaller, colder. Across the table, my grandson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. My granddaughter looked like she wanted to speak but thought better of it. No one defended me. No one asked Brian to stop. I felt something settle inside my chest then. Not anger. Not sadness. Something quieter. Something older. The kind of understanding that only comes after enough disappointments. I set my coffee cup down carefully. The coffee had already gone cold. "I see," I said. Brian looked almost surprised by how calm I sounded. Perhaps he expected tears. An argument. A scene. Instead I stood, straightened my cardigan, and walked out of the room without another word. Behind me, conversation slowly resumed. By the time I reached the garage, I could hear them talking again as if nothing had happened. I opened a storage cabinet near the back wall and pulled out a small wooden box covered in dust. My husband had given it to me years ago with very specific instructions. I had never opened it. I never thought I would need to. As I carried it toward my car, I remembered the last thing he said about it. "If anyone ever tries to push you out of your own home, Margaret, open the box." Standing there beneath the fading California sunlight, I finally lifted the lid. The box was smaller than I remembered. It was made of dark walnut, worn smooth at the corners by time, with a brass latch that had dulled over the years. I carried it into my bedroom and placed it carefully on the quilt that my husband and I had bought during a trip to Monterey decades ago. For several minutes I simply stared at it. Outside the window, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the backyard. The lemon tree Richard planted the year Rebecca graduated from high school was still standing near the fence. Everything looked normal. That was the strange part. Life rarely announces the moment it changes forever. Sometimes it happens quietly at a Sunday dinner table. Sometimes it happens with a single sentence. I finally opened the latch. Inside were several neatly organized folders, a handwritten letter, and a small ring of keys attached to a faded blue tag. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the letter. Richard's handwriting appeared exactly as I remembered it. Strong, careful, familiar. "Margaret, if you are reading this, then someone has forgotten that kindness is not the same thing as surrender." I stopped reading for a moment and closed my eyes. Even after 3 years, seeing his words felt like hearing his voice again. The room suddenly seemed less empty. I continued. "There are documents in this box that you may never need. I hope that is the case. But if anyone ever tries to convince you that this house belongs to them more than it belongs to you, speak with James Porter before you do anything else. Trust the documents. Trust the facts. Most importantly, trust yourself." A business card slipped from between the pages. James Porter, attorney at law. The name sounded familiar. Richard had worked with him for years. Beneath the card sat a thick folder labeled Property Trust. I opened it slowly. The legal language was dense, but one detail immediately caught my attention. My name. Not Rebecca's. Not Brian's. Mine. I spent the next hour reading every page I could understand. By the time evening arrived, confusion had begun to give way to something else. Questions. Lots of questions. Why had Brian become so confident recently? Why had Rebecca stopped discussing financial matters with me? Why had a real estate brochure appeared on the kitchen counter 2 weeks earlier? Small details that once seemed unrelated were suddenly connecting in ways I did not like. Downstairs I heard laughter drifting from the family room. Brian's voice carried easily through the house. He sounded relaxed, victorious even, as though the future had already been decided. I carefully returned every document to the box and locked it again. Then I picked up the business card and entered the number into my phone. It was nearly 7 o'clock. The office would be closed. I expected voicemail. Instead, the call was answered after 2 rings. James Porter speaking. For a moment I could not find the words. Then I took a slow breath. Mr. Porter, I said quietly. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I think my husband expected me to call you someday. The silence on the other end lasted only a second. Margaret, he replied calmly. I have been wondering when that day would finally come. The next morning arrived wrapped in a layer of coastal fog that hung over the neighborhood like a gray blanket. I barely slept. Richard's letter sat on my nightstand beside the reading glasses he used to wear every evening before bed. For years I had looked at those glasses and felt only loss. This morning they reminded me of something different. Preparation. Richard had seen something coming long before I did. At exactly 10 o'clock, I pulled into a quiet office park 20 miles away and parked beneath a row of tall eucalyptus trees. James Porter greeted me personally in the lobby. He was older than I remembered, his hair completely silver now, but his handshake was steady and his eyes were sharp. He led me into a conference room overlooking a small courtyard filled with roses. For a few moments he simply studied me. Richard always worried more about your future than his own, he said finally. I smiled faintly. That sounds like him. James opened a thick file and placed several documents on the table between us. Before we discuss anything else, he said, I need to ask a question. Has anyone recently suggested that you leave your home? I thought about Brian standing in the living room, Rebecca staring at her plate, the silence that followed. Yes, I answered quietly. James nodded as though he had expected exactly that response. He slid a document toward me. Then you need to understand something very clearly. The assumptions being made inside that house are based on information that is incomplete. Incomplete. The word settled heavily in my mind. Over the next hour he explained details that Richard had carefully arranged years earlier. Some of the language was complicated, but one fact became increasingly obvious. Certain decisions about the property could not legally happen without my direct involvement. Not Rebecca. Not Brian. Me. Every page seemed to reveal another piece of a puzzle I never knew existed. When the meeting ended, James handed me copies of several documents and a legal pad filled with notes. Do not confront anyone yet, he advised. People reveal the most when they think they have already won. The drive home felt different from the drive there. The roads were the same. The houses were the same. Even the weather had not changed. Yet something inside me had shifted. For months I had been reacting to events without understanding the full picture. Now I finally had questions worth asking. As I turned onto my street, I noticed an unfamiliar vehicle parked in front of my house. A black luxury SUV. 2 men stood near the front walkway speaking with Brian. One carried a leather portfolio. The other held a tablet. I slowed the car and watched from half a block away. Brian pointed toward the house several times while talking animatedly. The men nodded and made notes. Then one of them walked toward the backyard gate. A strange feeling settled into my stomach. Not fear. Recognition. Suddenly the real estate brochure on the kitchen counter made sense. The whispered conversations. The sudden confidence. The pressure. They were already acting as though decisions had been made, as though ownership had quietly changed hands. I remained parked at the curb for another minute, watching Brian laugh at something one of the men said. He looked relaxed, comfortable, certain. Then I glanced at the folder resting on the passenger seat beside me and remembered James's final words. Let them keep talking. Let them keep assuming. Because sometimes the most valuable information comes from people who believe nobody is paying attention. That evening I behaved exactly as I always had. I helped clear the dinner dishes. I watered the potted herbs near the kitchen window. I asked my grandchildren about school. If Brian noticed anything different, he did not show it. In fact, he seemed more confident than ever. Confidence has a way of growing when it goes unchallenged. Rebecca spent most of the evening scrolling through her phone while Brian talked about market conditions, property values, and investment opportunities. He spoke as though he were hosting a seminar instead of a family dinner. Every few minutes he mentioned how much homes in our neighborhood were selling for. Every few minutes he reminded everyone how quickly prices were rising. Before my meeting with James, I might have dismissed it as casual conversation. Now every sentence sounded deliberate. Every comment felt rehearsed. After dinner I carried a basket of folded laundry upstairs and paused outside the guest's bedroom. The door was partially open. Inside, Brian and Rebecca were talking quietly. I had no intention of listening. Then I heard my name. I stopped. The longer we wait, the harder it becomes, Brian said. We already have interested buyers. Rebecca sighed heavily. I know. Then we need to move forward. There was a long pause. She is still my mother, Brian. His answer came quickly. Too quickly. And we are trying to do what is best for everyone. Best for everyone. It was remarkable how often people used those words when discussing plans that benefited themselves. I quietly continued down the hallway before they noticed me. Later that night, sitting alone in my bedroom, I found myself thinking about Rebecca as a little girl. She used to leave handwritten notes under my pillow before school field trips. She used to run into my arms after soccer practice. 4 years after Richard died, I convinced myself that her growing distance came from grief. Now I was no longer certain. Grief changes people. But so does ambition. The next morning another strange detail appeared. A professional photographer arrived at the house shortly before noon. Brian greeted him at the front door and spent nearly 2 hours leading him from room to room. The man photographed the kitchen, the family room, the backyard, even the primary bedroom. When I asked what was happening, Brian smiled politely. Just documenting some renovation ideas. Renovation ideas. I nodded as though I believed him. Then I watched the photographer capture wide-angle images of nearly every room in the house. That afternoon I received a call from James. I found something you should see, he said. His tone immediately caught my attention. What kind of something? I asked. There was a brief silence. The kind that explains why people suddenly become interested in property they never paid for. My grip tightened around the phone. Outside my window, I could see Brian standing near the backyard patio speaking with someone on speakerphone. He looked relaxed, comfortable, certain of his future. Meanwhile, James lowered his voice and said something that made me sit down immediately. Margaret, I believe someone has been making plans using information they were never supposed to have access to. For several seconds I could not speak. I stared through the kitchen window at Brian while his voice drifted faintly across the patio. He was smiling. Whatever conversation he was having seemed pleasant, ordinary. Yet James's words echoed in my mind. Someone had been making plans using information they were never supposed to have access to. What exactly did you find? I asked quietly. Papers rustled on the other end of the line. Over the past 6 months, there have been multiple inquiries regarding the property trust. None were authorized by you. A chill moved through me despite the warm California afternoon. Can someone do that? They can ask questions, James replied. The problem is that whoever made those inquiries seemed unusually confident about details that were never publicly available. I sat down at the kitchen table. The same table where Rebecca used to do her homework. The same table where Richard drank coffee every morning before work. Suddenly the room felt unfamiliar. Who made the inquiries? I asked. There was a pause. That is where things become complicated. James explained that privacy rules prevented him from obtaining every record immediately, but one name had appeared more than once during preliminary research. A local real estate consultant. Someone connected to several luxury property transactions throughout Southern California. The same type of person who would never become involved unless someone expected a sale. After the call ended, I remained seated for a long time. The refrigerator hummed softly. A clock ticked somewhere in the hallway. Outside, Brian finished his conversation and walked back into the house carrying himself with the confidence of a man who believed his future was already secure. That evening Rebecca knocked on my bedroom door. She rarely did that anymore. "Mom," she asked softly, "do you have a minute?" I invited her inside. She sat at the edge of a chair near the window and folded her hands together. For a moment she reminded me of the nervous teenager who used to ask permission before borrowing the car. "Brian thinks we should start discussing long-term plans," she said carefully. There it was. Not a question. A prepared conversation. "What kind of plans?" I asked. Her eyes lowered. "You know, the future. The house. Maintenance. Property taxes. Things like that." I nodded slowly. "And whose future are we discussing?" Rebecca looked uncomfortable. "Mom, that is not fair." Fair. Another word people often use when they want something. I studied her face. The familiar blue eyes. The same freckles she had as a child. Then I noticed something else. Guilt. Small. Hidden. But definitely there. "Rebecca," I said gently, "has Brian already spoken to someone about selling this house?" Her head snapped up so quickly that she answered before thinking. "Who told you that?" The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. She realized her mistake immediately. So did I. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then she stood. "I should get dinner started." She left the room before I could respond. Later that night I sat alone on the back patio watching the last sunlight disappear beyond the hills. Somewhere inside the house, Brian and Rebecca were talking quietly. I could not hear the words. Only the voices. For the first time I stopped wondering whether they had a plan. They did. The real question was how much of it had already been set in motion without my knowledge. The following morning I met James again, this time at his office rather than over the phone. The fog had lifted early, leaving the California sky clear and bright, but I carried a feeling of heaviness with me that no amount of sunshine could change. James was already waiting when I arrived. Several folders sat neatly arranged across the conference table. He did not waste time with small talk. "I think we finally understand what has been happening," he said. He opened one of the folders and slid a document toward me. At first glance it looked ordinary. Then I recognized a familiar address. My address. Over the next hour he carefully explained what his research had uncovered. Months earlier inquiries had been made not only about the property itself, but also about possible transfer scenarios, valuation estimates, and future listing strategies. None of those actions were illegal on their own. The troubling part was how specific the questions had been. Whoever asked them seemed convinced that ownership would soon become available for negotiation. "They were planning ahead," I said quietly. James nodded. "Very far ahead." I stared at the papers. For years I had assumed my greatest challenge after Richard died would be loneliness. I never imagined I would find myself studying documents that revealed people inside my own family were building plans around a future they did not control. "There is something else," James said. He opened another folder. Inside was a copy of a trust amendment Richard had signed years before his death. I read it twice before the meaning fully settled in. Certain protections had been added specifically to prevent outside influence, unauthorized transfers, or pressure placed upon the surviving spouse. Richard had anticipated circumstances I never considered. Suddenly memories began returning. Casual comments Brian made after family gatherings. Questions about property taxes. Questions about insurance. Questions about market values. At the time they seemed harmless. Looking back, they formed a pattern. When I left the office that afternoon, I felt strangely calm. Not because the situation had improved, because uncertainty had finally been replaced with clarity. That evening I returned home and found Brian setting up brochures across the dining room table. He quickly gathered them when he noticed me, but not before I recognized several local real estate company logos. Researching something? I asked pleasantly. He smiled. Just looking at market trends. Market trends. The phrase almost made me laugh. Instead, I nodded and continued toward the kitchen. Behind me, I could feel him watching. For the first time, I realized something important. Brian believed he understood the game. He believed he had already calculated every outcome. What he did not know was that Richard had been thinking several moves ahead years before any of this began. Later that night, I sat alone in the backyard. The air smelled faintly of jasmine from the garden along the fence. Above me, the first stars appeared. Inside the house, lights glowed through the windows while distant voices drifted from the family room. I listened for a moment and then looked down at the folder resting beside my chair. For weeks they had been preparing for a future that existed only in their imagination. Soon they were going to discover the difference between assumption and reality. Over the next several days, I did exactly what James suggested. I watched. I listened. Most importantly, I stopped correcting people when they made assumptions. It was remarkable how much information appeared once I stopped arguing. Brian became increasingly comfortable discussing the future as though it had already arrived. One afternoon, he stood in the kitchen reviewing renovation estimates while speaking on the phone. Another day, he spent nearly an hour walking through the backyard with a landscaping consultant. Every conversation carried the same underlying message. He believed he was preparing for ownership, not possibility. Rebecca seemed different. More anxious. More distracted. Twice I noticed her staring at me as though she wanted to say something. Twice she looked away before speaking. Guilt has a way of exhausting people. One evening my granddaughter Emily knocked softly on my bedroom door. At 16, she had grown taller than her mother and inherited Richard's thoughtful eyes. "Grandma," she asked quietly, "can I sit with you for a minute?" We sat together near the window while the sunset painted the hills gold and orange. For several moments neither of us spoke. Then she surprised me. "Everybody has been acting weird lately." I smiled gently. "That is one way to describe it." Emily lowered her voice. "I heard Mom and Dad arguing last night." My attention sharpened immediately, but I remained calm. "Families argue sometimes." She nodded. This felt different. She hesitated before continuing. "Dad said everything was already arranged. Mom said maybe they were moving too fast." Moving too fast. The words lingered in my mind long after Emily left the room. Later that night I passed the family room and noticed a stack of folders sitting on the coffee table. Brian had apparently stepped outside to take a call. Rebecca was upstairs. The folders were partially open. I had no intention of searching through them. Then one page shifted beneath the air conditioning vent. My address was visible at the top. Beneath it sat several printed figures and a projected listing price that made my stomach tighten. The house was no longer being discussed as a possibility. It was being discussed as an asset, a transaction, a future sale. I quietly continued walking before anyone noticed. The next morning James called. "I think we are close," he said. "Close to what?" I asked. "Close to the moment they stop being careful." He explained that people often become reckless when they believe success is guaranteed. They stop hiding details. They stop checking facts. They start acting openly. As I ended the call, Brian walked into the kitchen carrying a folder and a confident smile. "Good news," he announced. "I think it is finally time we all sit down and have a family meeting." For a moment neither of us spoke. Then I smiled politely and poured myself another cup of coffee. "That sounds like an excellent idea," I said. The relief that crossed his face told me everything. He truly believed the meeting would be the final step in his plan. What he did not realize was that I had already agreed to a different meeting. One scheduled for the same day. One involving documents he had never seen. The family meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon. Brian announced it 3 times during the week, each time with the confidence of a man unveiling a major achievement. By the morning of the meeting, the house felt strangely tense. Rebecca moved through the kitchen distracted and quiet. Emily barely spoke during breakfast. Even my grandson Noah seemed aware that something important was approaching. Brian, however, appeared energized. He wore a pressed button-down shirt and spent most of the morning organizing papers across the dining room table. Every few minutes he checked his watch. Every few minutes he rearranged the same stack of documents. I spent the morning exactly as I normally would. I watered the roses near the front porch. I read for an hour in the sunroom. I even baked a lemon loaf using a recipe Richard loved. The smell filled the house by noon. If Brian expected nervousness from me, he was disappointed. Shortly after 1 o'clock, the doorbell rang. A man and a woman entered carrying portfolios and professional smiles. Real estate professionals. Brian greeted them warmly and introduced them as trusted advisors. Advisors. Another interesting word. The dining room gradually filled. Rebecca took a seat near the window. Emily and Noah sat quietly beside each other. I chose my usual chair at the end of the table. The same chair I had occupied during birthdays, holidays, and family celebrations for years. Brian stood and cleared his throat. "Thank you everyone for being here," he began. He spoke for nearly 15 minutes about financial opportunities, market timing, and responsible planning. Charts appeared. Numbers were discussed. Future possibilities were presented as though they were already facts. Several times he referred to the house as a family asset that needed to be managed efficiently. Not once did he mention the person who actually lived there. Finally, he opened a folder and placed several documents on the table. "We believe this is the best path forward for everyone involved," he said. Rebecca stared at the papers without touching them. Emily looked uncomfortable. Noah glanced toward me. I simply folded my hands and listened. Then Brian said the sentence he had clearly rehearsed. "Margaret, all we need today is your cooperation so we can begin moving forward." Cooperation. The room became very quiet. I looked at the documents but made no effort to reach for them. Instead, I glanced at the clock hanging above the kitchen entrance. 1:48. Right on schedule. 2 minutes later, the doorbell rang again. "Actually," I said, smoothing the sleeve of my cardigan, "I am." Confusion spread across several faces. Brian looked toward the front hallway as footsteps approached the dining room. A moment later, James Porter entered carrying a leather briefcase. Behind him walked a second attorney holding several folders. The smiles vanished from the faces of the real estate advisors almost immediately. Brian's expression changed first to surprise and then to concern. James nodded politely toward the table before placing his briefcase beside my chair. "Good afternoon," he said calmly. "I understand everyone is here to discuss the future of this property." For the first time all week, Brian looked uncertain. And for the first time in months, I realized I was no longer the only person in the room who knew the full story. No one spoke for several seconds. The silence settled across the dining room like a heavy curtain. Brian looked from James to the second attorney and then back to me as though he were trying to solve a problem that no longer made sense. The two real estate advisors exchanged uncertain glances. Rebecca sat completely still. Even Emily and Noah seemed to understand that something important had just shifted. James calmly opened his briefcase and removed several folders. He placed them on the table with the same deliberate confidence I had seen in his office. Then he looked directly at Brian. "Before any discussion regarding future transactions can continue," he said, "certain facts should be clarified." Brian forced a smile. "I am not sure what this has to do with today's meeting." James nodded politely. "Actually, it has everything to do with today's meeting." He opened the first folder and slid several documents across the table. The property trust established by Richard Whitmore contains provisions that appear to have been overlooked. One of the advisors reached for the papers. As he read, his expression changed noticeably. The woman beside him leaned closer. Neither looked pleased. Brian shifted in his chair. "What provisions?" James folded his hands. "The most important one is simple. The property cannot be transferred, listed, marketed, pledged, or negotiated without the direct written authorization of Margaret Whitmore." The room went silent again. This time even the air seemed still. Brian stared at the attorney. "That cannot be right." James slid another document forward. "It is exactly right." Rebecca's face lost color. She lowered her eyes toward the table. For a moment I thought she might speak. Instead she remained silent. The advisors continued reviewing paperwork. One finally cleared his throat. "If these documents are valid, then any planning discussions regarding a future listing were premature." Premature. Such a polite word for what had really happened. Brian leaned back in his chair. There must be some misunderstanding. James remained calm. There is no misunderstanding. He opened another folder. There is also an amendment signed several years later. The second attorney handed copies around the table. This amendment specifically protects Margaret's occupancy rights and decision-making authority for the remainder of her life. Emily looked toward me with wide eyes. Noah slowly sat back in his chair. Rebecca covered her mouth with one hand. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was disappearing one person at a time. Brian glanced through the pages faster and faster. The more he read, the less certain he appeared. Finally, he looked directly at me. You knew about this? For the first time all afternoon, I answered immediately. I do now. No anger. No raised voice. Just the truth. Brian looked away. Across the table, one of the advisors quietly closed his portfolio. In light of this information, he said carefully, I believe our involvement here is finished. Within minutes, both advisors were gathering their belongings. The meeting Brian had spent weeks preparing was dissolving before his eyes. As the front door closed behind them, the house became quiet again. James packed his documents slowly before standing. Then he looked at me and smiled. Margaret, he said, the law has now said exactly what Richard intended it to say. I looked around the room. At Rebecca. At Emily. To Noah. Finally at Brian. Then I spoke the only words that mattered. The house was never the point. Respect was. No one had an answer for that.